In 1993, EA was dealing with a highly successful franchise in John Madden Football. They decided to leverage the Madden game engine and create a college football video game, being that they had former NFL head coach John Madden as the face of the Madden franchise. They decided to follow a similar formula and make Bill Walsh the face of their college football franchise. Bill Walsh, who was at the time considered by most the greatest NFL coach of all time, had recently retired from coaching the San Francisco 49ers and returned to college where he had began his head coaching career with the Stanford Cardinals. In this video, we're going to talk about the game that started it all and compare all three versions of this game. We will also talk about its sequel, which many consider the best football game of the 16-bit era, and discuss the other 16-bit entries in the series after Bill Walsh's name was removed from the franchise. Bill Walsh College Football was first released in late 1993 on the Sega Genesis and Sega CD. It was then later released in February 1994 on the Super Nintendo. The game was advertised in the October-November 1993 issue of Sega Visions. And this issue states that Bill himself scripted the game plans and scouted all the 24 current teams in the game. And I found this pretty interesting, because I always just assumed that Madden or Walsh simply got paid for the use of their name on a game. I never really thought that they initially did the scouting or drew up the plays. I'm sure that Madden has long since been removed from that process, but it's still pretty cool that at one point these franchises were tightly connected to the coaches. Alright, so there were three versions of the original Bill Walsh College Football. So let's talk about common features they all have, and then we'll get into some of the differences. The game consists of 24 current teams and 24 all-time teams, and EA didn't acquire any sort of NCAA licensing for the first installment. So the current teams were based on the likeness of teams and players from the 1992 season. So instead of the Ohio State Buckeyes, you would instead have Columbus. All versions of the game included either cards, posters, or manuals detailing all the teams, rosters, and player attributes. These were always so much fun to flip through back in the day, as I remember spending hours studying the different cards. Even with the lack of NCAA licensing, this initial title did a great job of giving you the college football experience with generic fans and fight songs. After playing Madden, it was so fun to play a college game based off its engine, with college-style play calling. The student body right and the student body left, and then the option. Oh man, running the option in this game was and still is so much fun. They introduced a quick one-step play calling feature, allowing you to avoid picking a formation before selecting your play. This was the first and last time they used this feature in an EA football game, and it set a precedent, which is why many favor the NCAA franchise down the road over the Madden franchise. The precedent being that EA always took more chances with their college franchises. While EA was always a bit too safe with the Madden franchise, it grew stale from year to year. They would often use their college franchise to almost demo new ideas before introducing them to Madden. This is how NCAA 14 came to be my favorite football game to date. Now let's get into some of the differences of the three versions. The Genesis and Sega CD versions are basically the same game. However, the music and sound is slightly better on the Sega CD version, due to the fact that it is a CD and not cartridge-based game. Unfortunately, this also causes some loading screens that really slow down your experience, and due to that fact, there isn't really any graphical differences from what I can tell. I just assume play the Genesis version, so that you don't have to deal with the loading screens. There is, however, some pretty large differences between the Genesis and Super Nintendo versions. To start with, the Genesis version only has 3 different game modes. You have Exhibition, Playoff, and All-Time Playoff mode, where Exhibition mode is pretty self-explanatory, and the 2 playoff modes are 16-team tournaments using either the current teams or the all-time teams. The SNES version has the 3 game modes that the Genesis had, although they call their Exhibition a regular game instead, but they also added a season mode, which splits the league into East and West conferences. The pregame presentation is slightly different, as the SNES version forces you through the Walsh report and team matchups, and then you can't refer back to them after the fact. The Genesis version doesn't force you through these and just lets you select them as you please. Once the game starts up, there is a noticeable graphical difference, as the Genesis version has larger sprites and just overall has a more colorful and vibrant appearance. The kick meter on the SNES has this annoying feature where you can't direct your kicks until the time between you select your kick power until the time when the meter comes back down. This can really be a nuisance when kicking field goals. On the Genesis version, you are just free to adjust the kick meter from any time you start the kick until any time you finish the kick, which makes for a much better experience. Another large difference is what's visible on screen pre-snap. The Genesis version only has a play clock, which is admittedly not enough information, where the SNES version has the play clock, game clock, quarter and down and distance, which is probably too much information and takes up way too much of the screen space. This is an area where they both do a pretty poor job and further installments improved on. Now to the most important comparison, and that is what happens post-snap. Or in other words, how does the gameplay compare? Well, not good if you're a Super Nintendo fan. This game was a classic example of why, even though the inferior hardware, the Sega Genesis dominated the 16-bit era as far as the sports genre goes. Because this game just plays so much smoother on the Genesis, which makes for a far better experience. This isn't a case of where the SNES version is so bad that it isn't playable, and if you only had a SNES growing up and you're nostalgic for this game, then I think you'll still have fun with it. But if you have the ability to play on either platform, then I would highly recommend the Genesis version. It's really hard to put into words, but I spent several days switching between the two, and there was always a significant drop-off in performance when I went to the Genesis to the SNES version. I'm pretty sure this was the consensus, and Nintendo must have known it as well, as they didn't make another college football game for 3 years. And oh boy, wait until we get to that one. But like I said, this version is not complete trash, and it does come with a season mode, which the Genesis version unfortunately lacks. If we now fast forward to the October-November 1994 issue of Sega Visions, we can see an advertisement for Bill Walsh College Football 95 on the Sega Genesis. This game was only available on the Genesis as it did not receive a Sega CD or Super Nintendo release. There were several large improvements to this game, and to start with, they acquired the NCAA licensing, which allowed them to use the school names, helmets, and logos. They included 36 current teams as opposed to the 24 in the original, but they also dropped the all-time teams. They introduced windowless passing for the first time in an EA football game. This really improved the gameplay experience significantly, as you could actually see the route your receivers were running on the field, as opposed to having the windows blocking your vision of the field. And if you really wanted to, you could still turn the passing windows on if you were just, stuck in your old ways. You now had the ability to check energy levels of players to help you monitor fatigue. They added 32 new plays to the playbook. They also added individual stat tracking, which allowed you to check stats both during the game and also see who's leading the country in several categories throughout the season. This was probably my favorite addition. While younger gamers may not realize this, but sports games didn't always track individual stats through season modes, and this pissed me off tremendously when they didn't do that. As far as the game modes, you now have the option to select between exhibition or season, and if you choose season, you can set the length between 1 to 16 weeks. Then you could decide if you wanted to end the season with playoffs or bowl games. They had not yet acquired the bowl licensing, so the bowl names were generic like the Pecan Bowl. Also, throughout the season, there would be weekly national and division rankings. The pre-game presentation was pretty similar, however they removed Ron Barr, and now you just had Bill Walsh running the show on his own. Like I alluded to before, they removed the one-step play calling and went to a more traditional process where you select your formation first, then your play. In-game, they now presented the down and distance, which is a small but important detail that they were missing from the previous game. The gameplay itself was much improved as the controls were even smoother than the previous year. Most people will tell you that this was the best football game in the 16-bit era. I believe it's debatable, but there is no doubt that this game still holds up to this day. I played through an entire season recently and enjoyed every game along the way. The only thing that they removed from this game that I wish that they hadn't was the player celebrations, most notably the end zone dances. They only had those in the original game, and they didn't end up bringing them back. After consecutive losing seasons at Stanford during the 93 and 94 seasons, Bill Walsh retired from coaching, and thus his name was removed from the franchise. Really not sure if this was his decision or EA's, but it was a bummer in my opinion. However, it didn't stop EA from pushing forward with a college football game, as they still put out a game the following year in the fall of 1995 with the title College Football USA 96. They upped the ante this year, including all current 108 Division 1A teams, and got the licensing for 4 bowls, being the Rose Bowl, Orange Bowl, Fiesta Bowl, and Sugar Bowl. They also added 7 big-time conferences as opposed to the generic divisions in the prior year. They also added an MVP race, which is in essence the Heisman race. They removed the Walsh report, being that there was no more Walsh. There are now player injuries and substitutions. The substitutions were very handy because in years prior, when your halfback got tired, you were basically forced to either throw the ball or run plays that utilized the HB2 or fullback. They introduced more penalties, including offensive pass interference, holding, face masking, roughing the passer, and personal fouls. There is a nice little animation when a penalty is called where the official pops on screen and throws the flag. You now have the option to accept or decline certain penalties, and you can adjust penalty frequency via sliders, which I would suggest because there are way too many flags on the default settings. They introduce user records where the longest pass play or run play is saved and is visible via pop-up when each record is broken. Graphically, there is a slight improvement, and there is new character art and animations. The largest difference is probably the players can now jump, which can have a significant impact on the play. I have a love-hate relationship with the jumping, and I'm not really sure if I prefer it or not. Overall, I think this may be the best game in the series as far as the 16-bit era goes. I believe you could give a slight edge to Bill Walsh 95 as far as gameplay, but it's a slight edge at best. College Football USA 96 just has a lot more to offer, making it a more complete game in my opinion. Moving on to the fall of 1996, EA released College Football USA 97, and not only was this released on the Sega Genesis, but for whatever reason they decided to release it on the Super Nintendo as well for the first time in 3 years. And boy oh boy, what a nightmare that turned out to be. Let's first talk about what was new with the 97 entry. Most notably was the create a new player mode, and God, who doesn't love a good create a player mode? You can now make custom schedules, select between multiple difficulty settings for the first time with hard and easy settings. Then they also implemented the tiebreaker mode, and of course they had to add 4 new teams and 1 new conference. They must have acquired new licensing as they changed the MVP race to the Heisman race, and the rankings were changed to the USA Today, CNN, Coaches Poll. Once again, they made graphical improvements as the sprites appear larger and with more detail. So for gameplay, let's start with the Genesis version. Now the game runs fine, and by that I mean that the game isn't hampered by slowdown due to the increased size and sprites. But for some reason, it just isn't as fun as previous versions. I feel like they went for a more simulation gameplay style here, so all in all, it's the deepest game, but I would go with 95 or 96 over this entry. Now for the Super Nintendo version. So I didn't realize that they even made a SNES version, but I saw some gameplay online. It was just in disbelief. I mean, it looked so slow, and I figured it must have been bad footage. I went ahead and bought the game, and let me tell you, it wasn't bad footage. It was bad game. This game is a complete abomination and totally unplayable. So once again, if you are a Super Nintendo owner, then I'm sorry, but your best option is the original Bill Walsh College Football, as it may be lacking in features, but at least it's playable. So that wraps it up for the 16-bit era. The series would undergo one last name change as it made its move to the Sony PlayStation with the title NCAA Football 98. It would find some stiff competition from Sony's own college football franchise, NCAA Game Breakers, which we may discuss in a later video. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and thanks for watching.